Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Your Money, the personal finance edition of Merryn Talks Money. In these bonus podcasts, we talk about the best strategies for making the most of your money. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, and with me, senior reporter and author of the Money Distilled newsletter, John Stepek. Hi, John.
Hi, man.
John, as you know, we are continuing on with our housing series, and we have got another very special expert guest on today. Today, we'll be speaking with Ray Boulger. Ray is the Senior Mortgage Technical Manager, that's quite a title, at independent mortgage broker John Charcol, and is regarded as not just an authority, but the authority within the mortgage industry. We've asked Ray in to help us answer one of our listener questions. Thank you so much for being on the show, Ray. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So, here we go. Here's the question.
Hi, Merryn and John. My name's Ollie, and I'm London-based. I'm looking to buy a flat soon and was considering shared ownership. I was wondering, what are the pros and cons of shared ownership, and would you consider it over traditional mortgages?
My instinct there, and we'll get onto this, but my instinct is don't touch it with a barge pole. Run for your life and rent somewhere else instead. But you may have a more nuanced view. So I wonder if maybe we could start with, perhaps you could just explain to us, what is shared ownership? What does that mean? Who are you sharing it with?
Shared ownership basically means that you buy a property which will, at the moment, be a leasehold property, whether it's a house or a flat, but with the rules that the government's bringing in shortly, I guess that will become common hold in the future. And you normally buy it in conjunction with a housing association. You would buy between 10 and 75% of the property, and the housing association owns the rest. You would probably need a mortgage to buy your share of the property, and it is possible to get a mortgage of up to 100% of the amount you're borrowing. The housing association will charge you rent on the balance, and normally rent will be a subsidised rate, which frankly is the only way the monthly payments on this sort of proposition work. That's it. So that's the nuts and bolts bit.
So you find a house or a flat. It's normally going to be in some kind of housing association estate, I would guess. It's got to be housing association or council approved. You find a house that you would like to have. You can't afford to buy the whole thing. You look at what you can afford to buy. You take out a mortgage for that amount, the 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever it is. The housing association continues to own the rest. You pay pro rata rent for that section. And then, so you end up being liable for the mortgage on your share, for the rent on the share that you don't own, and then because it's a leasehold, presumably there is ground rent and service charges and all that kind of thing as well, upkeep of communal areas. And so you then pay your pro rata share of that. Is that right?
No, unfortunately that's not. So one of the downsides is that even though you may only own as little as 10% of the property, you are responsible for 100% of the service charge, 100% of the ground rent, 100% of the maintenance, such as any work you want to do on your property, such as decorating it. So generally speaking, buying as little as 10%, whilst it's an option, frankly, I think in most cases makes little sense.
Okay, I kind of knew that. I just wanted to hear you say it. So if you have your shared ownership house and you put in a new kitchen, which increases the value of the house by, say, 10%, and you only own 20% of the house, the other 80% of the uplift effectively goes to the housing association, and you would need to buy it back when you increase your share of the ownership.
Yes, if you did a major refurbishment, like putting in a new kitchen, then it would usually be possible to actually have a valuation pre and post, and you would get part of the benefit of that. But if you just do normal decorations, then yes, you're responsible for all of that.
Okay, so just to be clear, this all sounds insanely expensive, and I can see how it might make sense if you genuinely believed that over time you were going to buy the full 100%. And it was somewhere you genuinely wanted to live for a long time, and the estate in which you had chosen to live was extremely well managed, and you didn't have long-term service charge problems, and if you didn't have, for example, cladding problems. But out with all those things, And of course, house prices continuing to go up, so the thing is worth something when you try and sell it. Out with all that, it seems insane. Why would you not just rent somewhere? I mean, because you're effectively a renter. You're not an owner. You have none of the control. You have none of the power. And your expenses seem to me to be extremely high, particularly as mortgage rates rise. What am I missing?
I don't think you're missing very much at all. The one thing perhaps you are missing is that what you do have with shared ownership, which you don't have with renting, is security of tenure. That's perhaps the main benefit, but you're paying an awful lot for that security of tenure. So I think what's also worth bearing in mind is that what we find with a lot of first-time buyers is that they do have options they don't realise they have. You can, for example, get 100% mortgages in certain circumstances. There are other lenders that will offer you a mortgage with just a £5,000 deposit. So for some people, because they think the maximum they can borrow is 90 or 95%, there may be another option, even without a deposit. Likewise, even though in many cases the maximum you can borrow is 4.5 times income, there are other lenders that will lend you up to 6 times income. So if your problem is not enough income, that may be a way around it. Likewise, you can get mortgages on what's known as a sole proprietor joint borrower basis, where a family member helps you with the affordability. So before contemplating shared ownership, I would recommend that anybody who's considering this talks to a good independent broker who has an understanding of the whole market and looks at all the other options and only looks for shared ownership if really none of the options work for.
So I just want to ask you one more question before John is champing at the bit to get into shared ownership questions, but I want to ask you one more before I let him loose. So if you have to buy your share from an approved provider of shared ownership housing, which is going to be a local council or a housing association, etc., when it comes to sell, and this is slightly what I mean when I say you just have no control here, when it comes to sell, presumably you can again only sell that share to a buyer who is being pre-approved by the council or housing association. So you're not particularly free when you buy, you're not particularly free when you're living there, and you're certainly not free to sell to anybody when it comes to selling, and that might make it difficult. Is that fair? Or am I just being too down on this?
No, that's absolutely right. So you would certainly first have to offer the property to the housing association, and if they can't find a buyer within, say, 6 months, sometimes you may have an option to sell on the open market. But that clearly is a restraint, restricts your potential buyers and therefore the price you might get for the property. One other thing to consider is if you do want to staircase, which means buying a further share, you then click got to prove affordability. And one thing I would strongly recommend anybody contemplating buying any property, frankly, but in particular shared ownership, is to make sure they use an independent solicitor, not a solicitor recommended by the housing association, so we know you're getting genuine independent advice rather than perhaps advice from somebody who has a conflict of interest.
Are you suggesting that you can't trust your local housing association, Ray?
Well, we all know some of the problems with conflict of interest. Many of the problems with ground rent doubling every 10 years were caused by buyers using solicitors recommended by the developer.
Yeah. Ray, is it also the case that more often than not, when you enter a shared ownership contract like this, you're buying a new house? What's the percentage of new versus old? Because, of course, there's another whole area of jeopardy if you put your hard-earned cash into a brand new house, because I don't know what the statistics are at the moment, but historically, a new house has lost 16% of its value the second the broker puts the nice shiny keys in your hand. So that doesn't help.
No, that's certainly true. In the majority of cases, you would be looking at a new property. And, of course, one of the benefits, if one's going to look at positives here, is if you buy a new property, whilst the point you make about value is relevant, you will probably have relatively low heating costs because all new properties have to comply with current government regulations.
That's about the best effort at grasping at a silver lining I've ever heard on this podcast. Ray, thank you. Now, I'm sticking to my original analysis here. Kids, run for the hills. John?
I mean, I don't have that many more questions, but one thing I would ask, shared ownership's been around for actually quite a long time now. And so clearly people are using it. So I'm just wondering, in practical terms, you know, the volume of horror stories is not as high as I think I certainly felt that it would be 5 years on from when it first became popular. So, I mean, why do you think that is? Why is it still around?
Anybody who is struggling to find a deposit and affordability may find that the affordability works a bit better with shared ownership. But I think the point that was made earlier in terms of perhaps thinking of renting until you can afford to buy a property in the ordinary way is the key one. If you buy a shared ownership property and then at a later stage you're ready to buy a property in the normal way, you will no longer be a first-time buyer, which means you may then end up paying more stamp duty and land tax, which is frankly the main benefit these days in being a first-time buyer. So I think that is really a key point. If you can't afford to buy property in the ordinary way, bearing in mind all the legal implications and problems, even when you want to staircase up, when you want to sell, that's a strong argument for renting rather than shared ownership, in my view.
It strikes me that one of the big problems is the complexities of the legal side. And obviously a lot of these properties are also new and a lot of them are flats and leasehold as well. From your experience, how do mortgage lenders feel about this? Is it harder to get a mortgage on shared ownership properties, or are they actually relatively relaxed about it?
Well, there are plenty of lenders who will lend on shared ownership properties. Building societies tend to have the lion's share of this for the market. So whilst not every lender will provide you with a mortgage on a shared ownership property, there is plenty of choice. And there are a few lenders who will actually give you 100% mortgage on the part you're buying, although most will limit it to 90 or 95%. So the mortgage is not in itself a problem. However, you will probably pay a higher interest rate because you've got less choice.
Thank you very much, Ray. No, I think that's all my questions, and I basically have to agree with both of you. It sounds like very much a last resort kind of option.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say that I'm amazed that Ray has managed to find a negative to shared ownership that I hadn't even thought of, which was not being a first-time buyer anymore and losing your stamp duty advantage. So, Ray, it's unusual we have someone on who can find a negative about something that John and I hadn't thought of, given the way that our minds work. So we hugely appreciate that too. Ray, thank you very much indeed. And John, as usual, thank you. And thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Your Money. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also be sure to follow me and John on X or Twitter. I'm at MerrynSW. John is John_Stepek. This episode was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam. Special thanks to Ray Boulger. Questions and comments on this show and all our shows is always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net.